So this is our continuing reading group on Simondon's Individuation in Light of Notions of Form and Information. We're starting from page 296 of the translation. We're on I believe the third chapter in the part on psychic individuation. And then we're on subsection 3 of that chapter. So the title is Individuation, Individualization, and Personalization by Substantialism. So last time we saw this introduction of the term individualization as opposed to individuation, which sort of complicates our picture of what's going on. And we'll see in the reading for today about what the relationship is between these two terms, or how we should think about the relationship between them. The general idea is that individualization is a prolonging of the individuation process of something that's already individuated. Whereas you would have individuation of a living being, you have individualization of that already constituted living being in the formation of psychic individuation or individualization. And we saw Simondon uses this opposition between individuation and individualization to make sense of the Kantian terms of the empirical and transcendental subject. So the empirical subject would correspond to individualization, and then the transcendental subject would correspond to individuation. Simondon does a little bit of a digression about the relationship between the empirical and transcendental subjects or aspects of the subject and the character of a person. This is a sort of response to a problem in Kantian philosophy about how a subject is meant to be, can be held responsible for their moral character. It's sort of, Kant kind of paints himself into a corner with respect to how that type of moral responsibility should be understood. And Simondon tries to sort of develop a different way of understanding the relation of character to the empirical and transcendental subjects. And then we saw this section on the relation to the milieu. Simondon suggests that individualization, individuation and individualization can be understood in terms of the putting into question of the individual. So we have affective states or conditions, I guess we can say, that put the individual into question, which take place at the level of individualization. So he points to the example of fear or cosmic admiration, which puts the individual into question in terms of its existing individuation, as opposed to experiences that sort of fit into our existing framework of understanding the world or our existing conceptualization, so that it sort of fits in a familiar way into our habits and rhythm of life. And that would take place at the level of individuation. He talks about how the relationship to others fits into this picture. And this has to do with the way that we situate ourselves in relation to others. So we experience ourselves as being old in relation to someone who's young, or as young in relation to someone who's old, and we or as strong in relation to someone who's weak, or weak in relation to someone who's strong, and so on. So our understanding of ourselves, the properties that we ascribe to ourselves, are relative to other individuals, and so our understanding of ourselves relies on situating ourselves in relation to others at the level of individualization. So putting ourselves into question by situating ourselves in relation to others, and this relationship between these two aspects. So we have this sort of these experiences that put ourselves into question, and then our sort of everyday experiences. These two aspects in a healthy personality sort of line up with each other, or they don't conflict with each other, at least we can say. Disorders of personality can be understood, or at least some of them can be understood, as disorders of the relationship between these two sides. And so Simondon cites the case of the schizophrenic person who sees a woman in the street and has this emotional experience, and he's confused about what the connection is between this emotional experience and the seeing this woman in the street. He doesn't understand what the connection between the two is. And so this is a sort of disordered condition where having this emotional experience that puts himself into question is disjointed from the everyday categories of seeing someone in the street and classifying them as a woman. This is sort of the place, or one of the places, where things can fall apart in or come apart, I guess, in the psychic individualization, so that you can have psychic disorders through different sides not lining up with each other or not working together in a coherent way. And I think that's sort of a general principle in Simondon's understanding of psychic reality, is that it allows for these kinds of disorders to appear through misalignment or incoherence of different sides of the psychic reality.
Do you mean tagging their gender as a woman?
Yeah, exactly. So we have, like, part of the conceptual framework that we bring to the world and to people in the world is a gender. We sort of have an understanding of being able to assign a person to a given gender as like a familiar category. And in the case of the schizophrenic, for whatever reason, this experience of recognizing someone as a woman seems to have elicited this emotional experience in him that he didn't understand why he was having this experience, and so that's an instance of a misalignment between the familiar categories and the emotional experiences that put the self into question. Okay, so yeah, that's what we saw last time. Let's get into this week's reading. So I think this is another one of those giant paragraphs. Oh, it's actually not so long. But yeah, I'll start reading a page or so, and then we'll go around as usual. Okay, Section 3, Individuation, Individualization, and Personalization by Substantialism. It could be asked if there are individuals other than physical or living individuals, and if it is possible to speak of psychical individuation. In fact, it actually seems that psychical individuation is an individualization rather than an individuation, if we agree to designate by individualization a type of process that is more restricted than individuation, insofar as it requires the support of the already individuated living being in order to develop. Psychical functioning is not a functioning separate from the vital, but after the initial individuation that provides a living being with its origin, there can be in the unity of the individual being two different functions which are not superposed, but which are functionally relative to each other, just like the individual with respect to the associated milieu. Thought and life are two complementary, rarely parallel functions. Everything functions as if the living individual could once again be the theater of successive individuations that divide it into distinct domains. It is correct to assert that thought is a vital function with respect to a living being that would not be individualized by separating into a physiological being and a psychical being. The physiological and the psychical are like the individual and the complement of the individual at the moment in which a system individuates. Individualization, which is the individuation of an individuated being and results from an individuation, creates a new structuration within the individual. Thought and organic functions are the vital split along an asymmetrical rift, that is comparable to the first individuation of a system. Thought is like the individual of the individual, whereas the body is the complementary associated milieu of thought with respect to the already individuated synolon that the living being is. When the individuated living system is in the state of internal resonance, it individualizes by splitting into thought and body. Before individualization, psychosomatic unity is a homogeneous unity. After individualization, it becomes a functional and relational unity. Individualization is merely a partial splitting in normal cases, for the psychophysiological relation sustains the unity of the individuated being. Furthermore, certain functions never become solely psychical or solely somatic, and in this way they maintain in the living being the status of the individuated but not individualized being. This is the case for sexuality. This is also generally the case for the concrete inter-individual functions, like social relations, that concern the individual being. According to this path of study, The ensemble of psychical contents could be considered as the result of the resolution of a series of problems posed to the living being, problems the latter must resolve by individualizing. Psychical structures are the expression of this fractured individualization that has separated the individuated being into a somatic domain and a psychical domain. There is no identity of structures between the somatic and the psychical, but there are pairs of complementary realities that constitute living subsets on the level of the individuated being. The individuated being is expressed in partially coordinated successive somatopsychic pairs. Initially, the individuated being does not have a soul and a body. It is constructed as such by individualizing, by gradually splitting. There is no psychical individuation, properly speaking, but there is an individualization of the living being that gives rise to the somatic and the psychical. This individualization of the living being is expressed in the somatic domain by specialization, and in the psychical domain by the schematization that corresponds to this somatic specialization. Each psychical schema corresponds to a somatic specialization. The body can be called the ensemble of the specializations of the living being to which psychical schematizations correspond. The psychical is the result of an ensemble of sub-individualizations of the living being, and this holds for the somatic as well. Each individuation reverberates within the living being by partially splitting it in a way that produces a pair formed by a psychical schema and a somatic specialization. The psychical schema is not the form of the somatic specialization, but the individual that corresponds to this complementary reality relative to the anterior living totality. If the living being were to individualize completely, its soul would be a society of schemas, and its body would be a society of specialized organs, each carrying out a specific function. The unity of these two societies is maintained by that which does not individualize in the living being, and consequently resists splitting in two. Individualization is all the more accentuated as the living being is subjected to increasingly critical situations in which it manages to triumph by splitting within itself. The individualization of the living being is its real historicity. This is a pretty dense passage. There's a lot going on. Maybe to start with the title of the section, when he talks about bisubstantialism, he's of course talking about the duality between mind and body, or soul and body, as he sometimes says in this section. And so this bisubstantialism is what he's going to criticize, but also want to explain. So he wants to explain where this sort of understanding of bisubstantialism comes from. So why is it that people in the first place came up with the idea of bisubstantialism? So he's going to give an explanation of sort of the relative reality behind the idea of bisubstantialism, but he's going to qualify that. So it's only a relative reality. It's only to some degree correct to talk about the mind and body, or soul and body, as two different aspects of the human being, and it's going to be incorrect to describe them as two separate substances. And then we get this question of whether there is such a thing as psychical individuation. So is there such a thing as a psychical individual, which is distinct from the physical or living individual? And Simondon's answer to that question is going to be no. There is no psychical individuation in the proper sense of the term. So the living being doesn't undergo a further process of individuation, properly speaking. It instead undergoes individualization. So it's something already individuated that extends its process of individuation. And so psychical individuation is, properly speaking, an individualization and not an individuation. It's something that happens in an already individuated vital being, vital individual, rather than something that forms an individual that would be independent from the vital individual. And I think, let me just check the French quickly. I think there's a correction in the translation, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, so this passage in the second sentence here where he says, if we agree to designate by individualization a type of process that is more restricted than individuation. In the French, he actually puts it the other way around, and I think that's a mistake. I think the translation is right to correct this. So in the French, it says, if we accept to designate by individuation a process of a type that is more restricted than individualization, which I think is backwards. I think the correction the correction that's included in the translation, I think, is right. But it's possible that the correction is not accurate. So that's something to keep in mind. Oh, it looks like my screen share just died for some reason. Hold on a sec. Okay, there we go. Right. So we have this separation between the physiological and the psychical, which is a relative separation. So it's only insofar as you have an already existing vital individual that you can have a sort of separation between physiological and psychical that appears within that individual. And so within the individual, the psychical sort of so the vital individual sort of takes on the role of a pre-individual reality that undergoes this further individualization, and within that reality, the psychical has the role of the individual, and then the physiological, or the body, has the role of the environment. And so he even he talks a little bit later about I think it's St. Augustine, who describes the body as a sort of clothing for the soul, and so this experience of the body as being the external reality associated with the soul or the mind is one that Simondon wants to account for rather than just sort of dismissing. And so that's part of what this notion of individualization is meant to do, is to account for that experience, or that self-understanding of human reality as being split into body and soul. Maybe I should also mention this term sunolan, which we've seen a few times already in this book, but maybe not for a while, I think. But this is a term from Aristotle's philosophy, which it means the concrete reality. So it's the something that is a complete entity, something that's fully individuated, is a sunolan. And so here, Simondon uses the term to describe the living being. So the sunolan is what precedes the individualization within the living being. So the living being acts as this concrete reality, as this whole in which the psychical takes on the role of the individual, and the physical, or the body, takes on the role of the environment. Let's see, what else do we need to talk about in this part? Right, and then so again, the distinction between the psychical and the somatic is a relative distinction, also in the sense that different functions of the human being are never fully one or the other. So there's never something that is completely psychical and not at all somatic, or conversely something that's fully somatic and not at all psychical. Each function that the human being has is going to be a mixture of the two, or an intermediate form between the two. And so there are going to be some that are more psychical, or some that are more somatic, and then some sort of halfway in between the two. But this is again a relative distinction rather than a substantial one.
I had a question on one of these sentences towards the end of that last paragraph, where he says, each individuation reverberates within the living being by partially splitting it in a way that produces a pair formed by psychical schema and somatic specialization. Should that be individualization? So it seems like there's only one individuation, really, and afterwards you have individualization at the level of the already constituted individual.
Yeah, let me check the French quickly and see if there's a difference there. No, he says individuation in French too. Interesting. Yeah. I would think actually in the English here, in the previous part of the sentence where it says sub-individualization, in French it says sub-individuation.
Okay, I was going to ask about that too. That makes sense.
So yeah, he talks about it says the psychical is the result of an ensemble of sub-individuations of the living, just as the somatic is. Each individuation reverberates in the living being by splitting it partially, etc. He does use individuation both times in this sentence, but you're right that it does seem like individualization might be better here, because in the case of the living individual, there's one individuation. The living being is individuated once, and then individualization is a process that extends that individuation process. So yeah, this bit is tricky. I think, like I mentioned earlier on in this passage, I think Simondon gets it backwards here, or at least the editors did. I'm not sure, like in the manuscript maybe it was different, but I think he mixes up the two terms at one point here, and then I think the translation mixes up the terms at one point here as well. So yeah, it's easy to slip and write individuation instead of individualization, or vice versa.
Should have individuated that term a little further.
Yeah, it's maybe not a great terminological choice to choose two terms that differ only by a couple letters. I should also probably mention this bit about schematization or schemas, which I think is a bit obscure, but as far as I can tell, this is a reference to Kant's idea of schematization, which is has to do with the way that the categories of the understanding come to be applied to physical objects, and each of the categories has to be schematized by through the imagination, and so that means that it has to be something. It has to become something that can be applied in time. So, like the category of causation, for example, has a temporal element that's sort of introduced through schematization, and so the cause precedes the effect. This was something that is like a key point in Kant scholarship, the transcendental schema of the imagination. I think Cassirer and Heidegger had a debate about like how to understand this, if I remember correctly. It's like one of the more intricate parts of Kant that is like debated a lot within Kant scholarship. So exactly what he meant by the schematization process is not obvious, at least from an initial reading. But yeah, so for the purposes of this text, I think we can understand schematization as meaning something to do with time and imagination. I think that's probably what we need to draw from the Kant into this text. Okay, so I think we can go on to the next page or so if someone else would like to read.
Yeah, I can read. I guess it's a pretty short paragraph, so maybe I'll read until like the bottom of the next page.
Sure, sounds good.
Personality appears to be more than relation. It is what maintains the coherence of individuation and of the ongoing process of individualization. Individuation takes place only once. Individualization is as continual as perception in everyday behaviors. By contrast, personality concerns the domain of the quantum, of the critical. Structures of personality are established that last a certain amount of time, resist the difficulties they must take on, and then when they can no longer maintain individuation and individualization, collapse and are replaced by others. Personality is constructed by successive structurations that are replaced, with the new structurations integrating the subsets of the old ones and also leaving a certain number of the latter aside as unusable debris. Personality is constructed via successive crises. Its unity is increasingly strong the more this construction resembles a maturation in which nothing of what has been built is definitively rejected, but is, sometimes after a latency period, reintroduced into the new edifice. Individuation is unique, individualization continual, and personalization discontinuous. But the discontinuity of Genesis includes the unity of the process of organizational construction. In the actual expression of the harmonious personality, one can identify the anterior stages that it takes back up by integrating them into its functional unity. St. Augustine's expression, etiam peccata, even sens, is true solely on the level of the personality's construction. Indeed, it can be said that the personality integrates even sens without supposing that there is the occasional aspect of the felix culpa, blessed fault, which is inexplicable without resorting to a transcendence. The foundation of the problem of transcendence lies in the successive rapport of these phases of personality. All the schemata that seek to explain the inherence of a transcendent principle in man, or, on the contrary, that want to show that everything emerges genetically from experience, ignore the initial reality of the operation of individuation. It's true that the being, to the extent that it is individuated, does not have and will never have the complete course of its explication within it. The individuated being cannot account for itself or for everything that is within itself, no more than it can account for its emotion facing the starry sky and the moral law within it, or the principle of true judgment. This is because, in its ontogenetic limits, the individuated being has not retained within it the whole real from which it has emerged. It is an incomplete real. But it also cannot search outside itself for another being that would be complete without it. Whether according to creation or procession, the being that has allowed the individual to form has split, i.e., has become the individual in the complement of the individual. The first reality anterior to individuation cannot be recovered whole outside the existing individual. The genesis of the individual is not a creation, i.e., an absolute advent of the being, but an individuation within the being. The concept of transcendence mistakes anteriority for exteriority. The complete being, which is the origin of the individual, is both within the individual and outside it after individuation. This being has never been outside the individual, for the individual did not exist before the being has individuated. It cannot even be said that the being has individuated. There has been individuation within the being, and individuation of the being. The being has lost its unity and its totality by individuating. This is why the study of transcendence finds outside the individual and therefore finds outside the individual and before it another individual that both has the appearances of the individual and those of actual and contemporaneous nature, i.e. this complement of the individual. Should I keep going, or?
Yeah, we can stop there. That's fine.
Okay.
Yeah, again, this is one of these giant paragraphs with no good stopping points. So yeah, that's good. As good a place as any. Yeah, so again, there's a lot going on in this page or so that we just read. So there's first we have this idea of personality that comes back in, and if you remember from last week's reading or the week before, I think he talked about personality as the unification of individuation and individualization. So personality has this unificatory function in the human being. And personality also has this quantum character. So in the sense that it's structured in terms of these threshold effects, and it has these critical points. So rather than being a purely continuous function, it has these threshold points where you have these sudden qualitative changes. Yeah, and then this idea of personality as developing over time through successive crises. So because personality is structured in this threshold way, it means that each successive thresholds, each time that one of these thresholds is crossed, you have a crisis or some sort of transition from one personality condition to another. Yeah, I should probably mention, so critical and crisis have the same Greek root, which has to do with division or separation or something along those lines. And so a critical point and a crisis are the same sort of idea. Right, and then there's this idea of personality as incorporating what came before, and this is so this is personality insofar as it's a kind of maturity or maturation. So maturation is personality insofar as it incorporates everything that came before. So you have these successive crises of personality or transitions of personality, but insofar as the development of personality is a maturation, it won't sort of give up anything that happened before. It will incorporate that eventually into the whole structure of personality. And so this is a sort of ideal condition, I guess you can say, of personality that we would want. We would want our personality to be able to incorporate everything that we have experienced and every condition that we've been in throughout our lives, and so it would not reject anything as being foreign to it. And so this is where Augustine's expression here about even sins. I don't remember this passage exactly, but I think the idea is that even sins sort of go towards making up the personality of a person. So even sort of the worst parts of ourselves are part of our personality, and I think for Augustine, this would have the sense of the what here Simondon quotes as the Felix culpa, the sort of blessed mistake, so that, because of providence, certain sins might lead you eventually towards the truth. But Simondon rejects that explanation as being as requiring this transcendence. So it requires something like providence or a divine intervention in the world to explain why our sins or mistakes might end up being blessed mistakes in the end. And then, so that leads into this long sort of digression about transcendence. And so I think this is probably the most, or the closest that Simondon gets to talking about like a sort of philosophy of religion in this part of the book. Because here he's talking about whether we can. So the question of transcendence versus imminence would be the question of whether we can explain human reality in terms of this genetic explanation on the basis of experience, or whether we need to posit something like an immortal soul, or something that transcends empirical reality and would be sort of implanted in the human being. And Simondon is going to argue that this is a sort of a false opposition, that each of the terms is sort of a non-solution to the problem, or it brings up more problems than it ends up solving, and we'll see that in more detail as we go along. But the idea is that Simondon is going to want to say that it's only through individuation and individualization that we can have that we can understand the coming into being of the human being, and so we can't treat the human being as a sort of self-subsistent substance, something that would be a sort of coherent whole without dependence on anything else. So there's each of these options, either the immanent or the transcendent option, sort of presupposes the existence of an individual already constituted as an explanation for the human individual or human reality, and so it's sort of presupposing what it's supposed to explain, and doesn't really provide an explanation because of that. And then we can also note that there is another reference to Kant here when he talks about the emotion. Of course, the famous Kant passage where he talks about how these two things fill him with more admiration. He thinks about them. So these are sort of the two sides of these two sides. Are both worthy of admiration and elicit wonder, and the sort of the beginnings of philosophy, according to Kant. But so for Simondon, that we have to recognize that each of these experiences indicates something that it goes beyond the constituted individual. So it's something else, like the human individual as something fully constituted and individualized can't account for either of these phenomena or these experiences from within itself, but it's only on the basis of the process of individuation through which the pre-individual being comes to be individuated and comes to form a human that we can account for these phenomena. Oh, maybe another translation note that I'll make here too is we've seen this, I think, or we've talked about this before with the translation of being and the being. It's so in French you use l'être for you can either translate that as being or the being, and in certain cases one translation might be better than the other. And so here in this passage, in the middle of this paragraphs, where he says, where is that? So about the halfway down the page, it cannot even be said that the being has individuated. There has been individuation within the being and individuation of the being. The being has lost its unity and its totality by individuating. Here I would translate some of these as being rather than the being. So I would say there has been individuation within being and individuation of being. Being has lost its unity and its totality by individuating. So the pre-individual being is a sort of indeterminate, which I would not translate with the being. I would use the being for like a living being, an entity. But yeah, so that's something to keep in mind when you see the being. You can always think that it could also be translated as being. Okay, so we can continue. Let's see, where did we finish? I think we're at but the image of the supreme being. If someone else would like to read from there.
I could read again.
Yeah, you're going to make us do all the work. Okay, yeah, go ahead.
But the image of the supreme being cannot become coherent because it is impossible to make coincide or even to render compatible aspects like the personal character of the supreme being and its positive personal character of the supreme being and its character of positive eternity and omnipresence, which give it a cosmicity. The study of imminence is doomed to the same ultimate failure, for it would like to recreate a world starting from what is founded in the individuated being. The aspect of personality is then predominant, but the cosmicity is obscured. The individuated being is thus found to be relative to the ensemble of the world in a double relation, as a being that includes nature qua naturing nature, and as a being that is a mode of natured nature. The relation of naturing nature and of natured nature is graspable with just as much difficulty in the study of the immanence within the individuated being as that of God as personal being, active agent, and God as omnipresent and eternal, i.e., as endowed with cosmicity. Both the search for transcendence and the search for immanence aim to recreate the whole being with one of these two symbols of the incomplete being that individuation separates. Before posing the critical question prior to any ontology, philosophical thought must pose the problem of complete reality, which is anterior to the individuation from whence the subject of critical thought and of ontology emerges. Veritable first philosophy is not that of the subject, nor that of the object, nor that of a God or nature searched for according to a principle of transcendence or immanence, but that of a real anterior to individuation, a real that cannot be sought in the objectivated object or in the subjectivated subject, but at the limit between the individual and what remains outside it, i.e., according to a mediation suspended between transcendence and immanence. The same reason that makes the study according to transcendence or immanence futile also makes the search for the essence of the individuated being in the soul or in the body futile. This search has led to materializing the body and spiritualizing consciousness, i.e., to substantializing both terms after having separated them. The term body after this separation conserves elements and functions of individuation, like sexuality. It also conserves aspects of individualization, like wounds, illnesses, and infirmities. Nevertheless, it seems that individuation dominates in the body insofar as it is a separated body, one that has its life and its death apart from other bodies, apart from other bodies that can be wounded or diminished without another body being wounded or diminished. Conversely, consciousness grasped as spirit contains the basis of personal identity. First, as an independence of consciousness with respect to the known material elements or objects of action. Body and consciousness then, in some sense, become two separate individuals between which a dialogue is established, and the total being is conceived as a reunification of two individuals. The materialization of the body consists in seeing in it nothing but a pure given, a result of the capacity of the species and of the milieu's influences. The body is then like an element of the milieu. It is the closest milieu for the soul, which becomes the being itself, as if the body enveloped the soul. This is what St. Augustine calls carneum vestum, fleshly clothing. Consciousness is spiritualized in the sense that expression becomes clear, deliberate, and reflective thought, willed according to a spiritual principle. Expression is fully uprooted from the body, in particular the gaze, which is perhaps what conveys the most profound and refined expression of the human being, becomes the eyes of the flesh. However, the eyes as the seat of the gaze's expression cannot be said to be of the flesh. They are the support and milieu of expression, but they are not of flesh in the way that a stone is of quartz or mica. They are not merely organs of a body, but the intentional transparency of one living being to other living beings. The body can be said to be of flesh as a possible corpse and not as a real living being. Sorry, my cat is trying to jump up on my table and steal my food.
Well, that's probably a good place to stop anyway. So let's stop there. Yeah. So I keep saying this, but there's a lot going on in this passage. So we start from. So we were talking about the opposition between transcendence and imminence, and so this calls up the option of transcendence would be the option for something like a supreme being as like a principle behind the formation of a human individual, and Simondon argues against this position on the grounds that this character of the supreme being has to is incoherent in the sense that it has to sort of combine together the properties of the individual and of the pre-individual in one entity. So on the one hand, the supreme being is supposed to have a personal nature, supposed to be a person. And then on the other hand, the supreme being is also supposed to be eternal and omnipresent, and so it has this cosmic character. And Simondon argues that these two sides, or these two characteristics that are supposed to hold of the supreme being, are incoherent. And so ultimately, this option of transcendence sort of tries to explain individuation of the living being, of the human being, through this pre-existing individual. And so it doesn't actually give us an explanation of individuation. It sort of presupposes that there's this already individuated being, the supreme being, and then it uses that to explain the individuation of human beings. But it doesn't. So it's a non-genetic account of individuation. It's one in which individuation is already presupposed to start with. And then conversely, the option for imminence, so the one that would try to explain everything in human reality on the basis of something arising from experience or from empirical reality, like absent something like a supreme being. This option likewise presupposes the pre-existence of the individual. It takes the already individuated human being and tries to explain everything about that individuated being from what's contained in it from the already individuated being. So there's again sort of presupposing the existence of the individuated being and then trying to explain the individuation on that basis, and it sort of goes in a circle because it starts from the already individuated human being and then tries to explain the human being's individuation on that basis again. And then we have this sort of allusion to Spinoza here. So the in the French, it's actually in Latin, and so it's even more obvious that it's an allusion to Spinoza. But so there's a Spinozistic terms of oh, actually, sorry, I'm wrong. It's in French in the French text. In Spinoza, there's this pair of terms, natura naturata and natura naturans, which are nature, natured nature, and naturing nature. It would be the sort of literal translation as it is in the text here. But the idea is we have nature insofar as it consists of already constituted entities on the one hand, so that's natured nature. And then we have nature insofar as it consists in the formation of entities or the constitution of entities on the other hand, and that's natura naturans, or naturing nature. And so here in this passage, Simondon is he's appealing to this distinction. He's saying that in the option of imminence, you end up with the same problem, or a problem of similar difficulty, which is the relation between these two sides of nature. So the individuated being is so the individuated being is sort of incorporated into nature in these two senses, or in these two aspects, but the relation between these two aspects is obscure, in the same way that in the transcendent account, the relation between God as person and God as pre-individual reality, or as a cosmic principle, is obscure. So both attempts, either the transcendent or the immanent attempt, they both start from one side of the relationship between individual and milieu, and they try to sort of recreate the whole out of the part, which is not something that Simondon thinks is possible. And we have here, Simondon describes these sides of the of reality as symbols, and we've seen this usage before. And then there's a footnote that's going to come in the next couple pages where he actually explains this again. But symbol here refers to the ancient Greek practice of having a token made of like a piece of stone or pottery or whatever that was broken in half. And then each party would keep one half, and then they would be able to recognize each other by putting the two halves together, and their descendants would maintain that relationship by the Greek name, like for symbols, is a symbolon. Yeah. Let me see if I can find the yeah, I'm going to see if I can find anything on this practice of sharing this token. Yeah, there's a Wikipedia page here. Yeah, or a Wiktionary actually. That preview is not very helpful. But yeah, so it's this practice of sharing this token that you split in half, and then it's inherited by the two descendants of the parties that share the relationship. So like this would be especially like the relationship between a guest and a host. They would that relationship was something that had a religious significance in ancient Greece, and so there was like an ongoing obligation in the families of the guest and the host to maintain that relationship, and this symbolon allowed them to or served as a token of that ongoing relationship. So Simondon always uses the term symbol, I think always. He generally uses the term symbol to refer to some aspect of reality that is complementary to some other aspect, and especially he talks about the way that the individual and the associated milieu are complementary to each other. So they're each half or each a portion of the pre-individual reality that splits into individual and associated milieu. And so in that sense, they're symbols of each other. Right, and there's that passage that I mentioned earlier where Augustine talks about the body as the fleshly clothing of the soul. So again, this idea of the body as the environment or the milieu, and then the soul as the individual within that milieu. Okay, so we can go on to the next bit from I think from the body can only be said on the top of 301. If someone else would like to read. Okay. Sounds like no one else is interested in reading today.
I can read.
Oh, sure. Okay. Thanks.
You're welcome. The body can only be said to be of flesh as a possible. Is that right place?
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, Cole says, and not as a living being. Every somatopsychic dualism considers the body to be dead, which is what allows it to be reduced to a meta. Soma, the body prison, as Plato calls it. Clitus 400b. The spiritualization of consciousness operates inversely to that of materialization of the body. The body is materialized to the extent what is identified with its instantaneous and consequently unexpressive physical reality. Consciousness is spiritualized to the extent what it is identified with a timeless reality. While the body is drawn towards the instant and reduced to it, consciousness expands to eternity. It becomes spiritual substance tending toward the state of non-becoming. Death, which serves the soul from the body, leaves the body to essential instantaneity, whereas the soul is freed into absolute eternity. To consider that death is a separation of the soul and the body. To know the being through the presence of its death, and to preface the knowledge of the being with a description of its body substantially after death is in some sense to consider the being is already dead during its very existence. For bisubstantialism would only be true in the hypothesis of the death that would conserve consciousness intact. This reductive reverser of time that permits seeing the living being in terms of what it will be after death implies begging the question insofar as one sets out, despite everything from the living being, from this edifice of life, that the expression of personality in somatopsychic interiorities, the experience of what is rarest and most elevated in vital becoming is what's used to enact this dissociation of the soul and the body. The bi-substantialist reduction broadly makes use of vital experience at first, then turns its back on this initial experience and turns back against it, a way of the abstract scheme of the that being. The notion of body and the notion of soul are two reductive notions, since they replace the individual being, which is not a substance, with a pair of substances, blending as many of substances together as one likes with a schemata of interaction, as subtle as one could imagine, will not succeed in recreating the initial broken unity. The somato-psychic distinction cannot go further than that of the pair of symbols. In the living individual, there are almost purely somatic structures and functions, at least in the sense in which materialism could understand it. There are also almost purely psychical functions. But above all, psychosomatic functions. The model of the living being is the psychosomatic. The psychical and the somatic are merely borderline cases that are never available in the pure state. What is eliminated from the living being via substantialist reduction is precisely the set of median structures and functions, like the unity functions of the expression and integration. Thus, Bergson's substantialism has led to the bisection of function, like that of memory, in the distinction between pure memory and habit memory. But the same study of memory shows that pure memory and habit memory are really borderline cases. Pure memory and habit memory are subtended by a network of significations that holds for the living being and other living beings. The position of sensation and perception still expresses the bisubstantialist preoccupation. Sensation would be sensorial. Example, somatic, i.e. somatic, while perception would involve a psychical activity that collects and interprets sense data. This opposition even extends to between feeling and affection. However, this opposition is not caused by their belonging to two separate substances, but by two types of functioning. On the contrary, if one compares science to perception, perception is what becomes somatic, while science is psychical. Both science and perception are in fact psychosomatic. They both suppose an initial encounter of the subject being and the world in a situation that calls the being into question. The only difference involves the fact that perception corresponds to the resolution of an encounter without the preliminary technical elaboration, while science stems from an encounter by way of the technical operation. Science is a technical perception, an extant brighter perception in a circumstance that supposes a preliminary elaboration but actually responds to a new engagement. When water rises into the barrel pump, technique suffices, but when water stops rising, science is necessary. Technical access is profitable for the development of the sciences, just as elan of the tendencies is necessary for the development of the perception. Since this excess and this elan make man once again face the need to stabilize the rapport between subject and the world by way of perceptive signification or scientific discovery. Finally, the opposition between man and animal, which is erected into a dualistic principle, originated into the somatopsy-chic opposition itself. With respect to man who perceives, the animal perpetually seems to feel without being able to elevate itself to the level of the representation of the object, separated from contact with the object. However, in the animal, there is also a relative opposition between instinctual behaviors, which draw their direction and their orientation from the pre-given schematisms, and behaviors organized reaction, thus revealing the establishment of definite presence to the world, along with the possibility of conflict. Instinctual behaviors are those that unfold, not without adaptation, since behavior does not negate adaptation, but without preliminary conflict. It could be said the instinctual behaviors one in which the elements of the solution are contained in the structure of the ensemble constituted by the milieu and the individual. On the contrary, a behavior organized reaction is one that implies the intention of a structure on behalf of the living being. Nevertheless, organized reactions suppose drives, but they add something to the situation on the level of the resolution. Drives, the tendencies that derives from them if objects are present, always play the role of motors. The difference from so-called human behaviors reside in the fact that motivation by instincts generally remains visible in behaviors when an animal is concerned and the observer is a human, whereas motivations that drive human behavior cannot be easily detected for another human as an observer. The difference is more so of level than of nature. By conflating simple instinctual behaviors in the animal with the conflicted reactions that overcome them, we improperly join the aspects of individuation and the aspects of individualization. However, it is correct that the behaviors arising from the individuation are more numerous, more easily observable than the behaviors individualization, but it is incorrect that the former are the only behaviors. Every individuation supposes an individuation, but the former adds something to the latter. The error stems from the fact that we search for behaviors that would not be instinctual. Nevertheless, when an absolute absence leaves the being in an anorexic state, no further behavior is possible. The finality of behavior is replaced by absolute indistinction, prostration, and the absence of orientation. The opposition between man and animal, which is unfounded, adds a new implicit substantialism to the basic substantialism by means of which we give individuality to the body and the soul in man. Maybe that's enough?
Yes, yeah, that's great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, this is one of these giant paragraphs that have no good stopping points. So let's see, where did we start? Right. So we have this opposition. We have the starting point is the somatopsychic unity for Simondon, and then the bodily and the spiritual, or body and soul, sort of arise as limit cases of experiences that are ultimately always somatopsychic. So they're both bodily and psychical at the same time. And then we have this in bisubstantialism, in the idea that the soul and the body are two separate substances that have some sort of interaction with each other. You end up with this spiritualization of consciousness and a materialization of the body. So the body is identified just with this sort of instantaneous physical reality. So it's just like if you take a time slice of a body, it's just this sort of inert piece of meat that has no sort of intellectual or spiritual or psychical properties to it, and then you attach onto that inert piece of meat, you attach this soul that has the properties of eternity, and that, as Simondon says here, it tends towards a state of non-becoming. So it takes on this state of eternity, and so what you're effectively doing when you treat the human being in this bisubstantial way, you're effectively treating the human being as already dead, as already separated into body and soul. And so you're treating the body as a sort of a corpse that, or a corpse in waiting, I guess you could say. as something that is essentially inert, and then you treat the soul as something that is essentially eternal and only sort of contingently related to the body. And this bisubstantialism is a sort of begging the question for Simondon, because you start from the living being. You start from the living being as the psychosomatic unity, and then you sort of revert back to this understanding of the living being, or of the human being, as this composite of the dead body and the eternal soul. You by doing that, you're sort of undoing the unity that you started with. So it's only on the basis of this initial unity that you can understand something like the interaction of body and soul. But then you turn around and deny that unity, which is what allows for you to understand that interaction in the first place. And so Simondon argues that any number of substances, no matter how, like whether you want to posit there's 2 substances or 20 or 1,000, and no matter what sort of interaction you imagine between those substances, you're never going to be able to reconstitute the initial somatopsychic unity. So it's only if you stay at the level of the somatopsychic unity and avoid this substantialization that you can actually understand human reality, as opposed to sort of breaking it up into these abstract substances. Yeah, this is definitely related to philosophy of mind questions about the relationship between mind and body, and whether that we can understand them as substances and so on. Yeah, and so Simondon would criticize any of these positions that are either that are going to posit the mind or body as substances, and try to account for the relationship between them. And then there's this bit on Bergson. I wish Alyosha were here to defend Bergson here, but Simondon argues that Bergson takes on this dualistic or bisubstantialist position in this distinction between pure memory and habit memory, and you can sort of extend this case or this argument to, I think, a lot of Bergson's work, where you have this opposition between duration and the spatial, where the spatial or the geometrical sort of corresponds to the role of intelligence or habit, or any of these principles that are involved in interaction with the everyday world, whereas pure time is sort of distinct from that interaction with the everyday world, and is a second principle that has this distinction. Whether Bergson should be interpreted as positing these as 2 separate substances, I think, is another question. But that's how Simondon interprets his work. And then he brings up the example of sensation and perception, and this idea, this sort of commonplace idea that sensation would be something bodily, and then perception would be something psychical, so that you would have sensations through your sense organs, and then perception would be some sort of intellectual construction or operation on those the data provided by your sense organs. And again, Simondon argues that this is a sort of a sort of misunderstanding or substantialization of what is originally a somatopsychic unity. And he illustrates this by talking about the way that you can relativize this opposition between the somatic and the psychical. So if perception is the psychical in relation to sensation, then you can sort of repeat the same construction, and you can say that perception is the somatic in relation to science as the psychical. And what this shows is that this opposition between somatic and psychical, it has to be understood in relative terms, and rather than in terms of an opposition between two different substances. And then he sort of briefly talks about science as an extension of perception, and having to do with this preliminary technical elaboration. And he just alludes to something that he develops in more detail in the technical objects book that we read months ago now. But in that book, he talks about how sort of the emergence of science has to do with the limits of technical action. And in particular, he talks about this example of the water pump. So you can produce pumps that operate through atmospheric pressure that will raise water up to, I think it's like 10.3 meters or something like that above sea level. But then if you just build a taller pump or like a bigger pump, and you try to pump water higher than that level, the water actually won't go any higher than 10.3 whatever meters above sea level. And this has to do with the relationship between atmospheric pressure and water density and so on. But it's when the possibility of technical action through constructing pumps meets this obstacle, this unexpected obstacle, that you end up having to develop scientific knowledge, where you start to understand the operation of pumps through some principles of like hydrodynamics or understanding of atmospheric pressure and so on. And so science emerges where technical action meets this unexpected obstacle for Simondon. And so that's what that bit about the water pump is talking about. Yeah, so it's sort of just alluded to in passing here in this book, but there's more development of this example in the on the mode of existence of technical objects in the third part of that book. Let's see, what else do we have in this bit? Right, and then we get into this opposition between human and animal, which again is understood in terms of this opposition between bodily and psychical. So the animal would be the bodily, and the human would be the psychical, or would be like an animal plus some other psychical substance. Of course, Simondon was going to criticize this conception of animal-human relationships, and he's going to suggest here that even if we understand the animal as being motivated by instinctual factors, and so in some sense, if we want to identify this instinctual side or this instinctual factor in animal behavior with the bodily, we can do that. We can regard animals as being bodily in that sense. But this doesn't mean that animal behavior is sort of fully understandable in terms of this instinctual operation or these instinctual factors. There's this other side of animal behavior, which is what Simondon here calls the relative opposition between instinctual behaviors and behaviors of organized reaction. So we have this this operation in which an animal selects from various possible instinctual behaviors in a way that solves a problem. And this, of course, depending on which type of animal, you get different sort of degrees of problem-solving behavior. But obviously, animals face all kinds of different problems in their life of how to find food, how to find a mate, how to avoid predators, where to find shelter, and so on. They have to sort of adapt their instinctual repertoire behaviors to a changing environment and solve problems. And there's some pretty elaborate, actually, problem-solving abilities that certain animals have, like crows. There's like famous experiments with crows that like will use one stick to pick up another stick to pick up the piece of meat in the jar or whatever, and figure out how to use one tool to get a second tool to get the food that they want. And I think it's in Japan where these crows figured out that they can drop like oysters or something onto the road, and then cars will run over the shell and break it open, and then they can pick up the pieces, pick up the meat inside the oyster or whatever it is. So yeah, crows have these pretty advanced problem-solving abilities, and you can see that in various primates, and octopuses actually also have like advanced problem-solving behavior, kind of surprisingly. But yeah, there's a wide variety of different problem-solving abilities that different animals display, and so you can't just reduce animal behavior to like a fixed set of instinctual abilities that they would just be sort of set off to pursue this instinctual behavior. Right. Oh, actually, I didn't know that. Yeah. So Angus has mentioned here that octopuses use groupers to hunt fish. I did not know that. That's interesting. Yeah. So they and it's especially surprising because octopuses are generally solitary. Most other animals that we recognize as having like advanced problem-solving abilities and what we would describe as intelligence are social animals, whereas octopuses are solitary in general. So yeah, it's and also they like their evolutionary lineage diverged from humans like 200 million years ago or something like that. So they're very distantly related to primates or even other animals that we would grant like a high degree of intelligence to. So they developed intelligence independently from all these other organisms that have higher degrees of intelligence. But that's a bit of an aside, but I thought it was worth illustrating a little bit what Simon was talking about here. Right, so is there anything else to... Yeah, maybe we can go on to the next bit here and see if we can finish this section today, because I think we have about a page left. Yeah, let's try to finish this section if someone else would like to read from the top of 303.
I can read. Where did we leave off again? Are we on the new paragraph?
Yeah, I think... yes, I think so.
Furthermore, there is a form of monism that is merely a bisubstantialism in which one of the terms has been obliterated. To say that only the body is determinative, or that only the mind, esprit, is real, is to suppose implicitly that there is another term for the individual, a reduced term deprived of its whole consistency, but nevertheless real as a useless or negated understudy. The loss of the role is not the loss of the being, and this being exists sufficiently to subtract from the dominant term a certain number of functions and to expel them back outside the representation of the veritable individual. Materialist monism or spiritual monism are in fact asymmetrical dualisms. They impose a mutilation of the complete individual being. The only veritable monism is the one in which unity is grasped at the time when the possibility of a diversity of functioning and structures is perceived. The only veritable monism is that which, instead of following an implicit dualism that it seems to refuse, contains the dimension of a possible dualism, but against a background of the being that cannot be overshadowed. This monism is genetic, for genesis alone presupposes unity that encompasses plurality. Becoming is grasped as a dimension of the individual starting from the time in which the individual did not exist as an individual. Dualism can only be avoided if one starts from a phase of the being anterior to individuation in order to relativize individuation by situating it among the phases of the being. The only compatibility of duality and unity is in the genesis of the being, in ontogenesis. In a certain sense, it can thus be said that the different notions of monism and of pluralism arise from a shared postulate, one according to which the being is substance in the beginning, i.e., exists as individuated before every operation and every genesis. Both monism and dualism, therefore, put themselves in the impossible situation of rediscovering an effective genesis, since they wish to make a genesis emerge from the already individuated being as a result of individuation. Nevertheless, the individual emerges from individuation, but the former neither contains the latter nor fully expresses it. This does not mean that the individual must be devalued relative to an initial reality that is richer than it, but the individual is not the only aspect of the being. It is only the whole being when it is associated with its complement, the milieu, which is engendered at the same time as the individual. Furthermore, the irreversibility of the ontogenetic process prohibits one from going back from the system posterior to individuation toward the system anterior to individuation. There are two errors in substantialism: that of mistaking the part for the origin of the whole by seeking in the individual the origin of individuation, and that of wanting to reverse the course of ontogenesis by making individuating existence emerge from individuated substance.
Right. So this bit is largely sort of restating some of the basic principles that he set out in the introduction to the book that we read many months ago now. So the basic idea, the basic principle here is that you can only grasp the true reality, the whole reality of a being through Genesis and through situating the individuated reality, the individuated being, as one phase of being rather than the whole of being. So the individuated being arises from a pre-individual reality and is always relative to an associated milieu which is not individuated. So it's only by holding on to this genetic understanding of reality that you can avoid this dualism that sort of tries to reconstruct one side of the opposition on the basis of the other. And so this bisubstantialism makes these two errors of, on the one hand, taking the individuated being as the origin of the individual, and as we saw earlier, this idea of this sort of vicious circle that you end up in if you try to explain the individual on the basis of what's only contained in the individual. And then the second error is this idea of starting from the individuated substance, the already individuated substance, and then trying to explain individuation on that basis, which would sort of reverse the course of ontogenesis, which proceeds from individuation and from individuation to the individuated being. And so these are the two errors of the substantialist point of view. Yeah, there's definitely resonances here with the pluralism equals monism idea that in a Thousand Plateaus, and I'm not sure if Deleuze actually read this part of the book because I don't think he ever cites it directly, but yeah, there's definitely an easy comparison to make between those two passages. Okay, so I think we can end here for today and then pick up from section 4 next time at the bottom of 304, if that works for everyone.
Sounds good.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you everyone for joining in today, and see you all next week.
Thanks, Nan. Thanks, everyone.
See you next week.